the Government Accountability Office is projecting that operating deficits for state and local governments will become increasingly common over the next 10 years. I was actually just reading a piece from the Brookings Institution where they were looking at federal budgets and noted that federal expenditures for non-defense discretionary activities are projected to decline by about 50% relative to GDP. So right now they're at about 3.2% of GDP. The projection is that by 2024, that will be at 2.2% of GDP. And just as a reference point, that spending for the last 40 years had been at 3.8% of GDP. So we're going from 3.8 to 2.2. It's a tremendous retrenchment happening at the federal level, which has clear implications for what's going to happen with states and localities. So the question is, what do we make of this? What should we do? And that's why we're here today, and I'm pleased to have with me four experts who have been out in the trenches, either doing research or working hard to make sure that our local governments and state governments operate in a responsible and effective way. And I'm pleased to have this conversation. I should also say that the backdrop for this is a project that was funded by the Haynes Foundation, looking at fiscal sustainability at the state and local level. It involved some of my colleagues, so Jan Tang, Mark Pisano, two of our panelists, Rich Callahan and Gloria Rubio-Cortés, and Michael McGrath, as well as a number of people who have been collaborators for parts of this. So this is a large effort. It has spawned a lot of writing, a lot of thinking about this, and I'm sure as we go through the course of today, we will learn a lot more about that project as well as some of the things that have been learned from there. So the way we're going to structure this, there's no agenda here, and there aren't going to be PowerPoint presentations. So this is really designed to be a conversation where we draw on the expertise of our panelists, but then also draw you into the conversation so that we can talk back and forth and really make sure that we cover the things that you're interested in, and maybe have all of us leave with some new thoughts and understanding about the fiscal challenges that we face, as well as some of the approaches we might take to solve them. So I'm hopeful in the next hour and 15 minutes, we're going to learn a lot, push each other a bit, and leave here hopefully more hopeful about what's possible and what can be done. All right, so with that, let me introduce the four panelists. We'll start at the furthest to my left, which is the furthest to your right, with Rich Callahan. He's an associate professor at the University of San Francisco. He's one of the co-participants in the Haynes Project, and he's a former professor here at the Price School, having worked in the Sacramento Center for many years. Rich specializes in governance issues, organizational theory, and public management, and he grew up just 5 miles from my hometown in South Jersey. So when you hear that accent, that's what that is. Next to Rich is Gloria Rubio-Cortés. She is the president of the National Civic League and is also the executive editor of the National Civic Review. She's been a leader in multiple sectors, so business, philanthropy, and nonprofits through her esteemed career. And she works in civil rights, community building, civic engagement, and social justice. And all of those are important factors when we think about local government functioning. And so your insights will be much anticipated. Next to Gloria is Clifford Graves. He is the former CAO of the County of San Diego. I actually should have started with your higher level position. So he's a former assistant secretary at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Community and Economic Development. So we're kindred spirits in that regard, both having served in that crazy building. And most recently, he has been serving in the city of Carson as redevelopment director and doing a number of other planning issues there, tasks there. He has a tremendous amount of experience in the working of local government and how local governments think about spending money. And so thank you for being here as well. And then last but certainly not least, to my immediate left is Ron Loveridge. He, in some ways, is a legend of the Inland Empire, having been on the council at the city of Riverside for 30 years or so, and the mayor for 18 years. And you've heard people say mayor for life. Ron could have been mayor for life. He'd still be mayor now if he decided not to step down. So Ron has been a national leader in a number of capacities. He's been the president of the National League of Cities. He is a member of the National Academy of Public Policy. And he's an advisory board member to my center, the Bedrosian Center. So Ron, you have many linkages, links, and your experience will be greatly welcomed on this panel. Please join me in welcoming all of you. Thank you for being here. All right, so as I said, there's no agenda on this, and in fact, our panelists don't know what I'm going to ask them. So we are going to truly get their off-the-cuff, sort of real reactions to questions in real time. I wanted to start with a high-level question. So we had the city of San Bernardino, we've had Detroit, two highly prominent local bankruptcies, where local cities just couldn't find a way out. And I'm wondering your thoughts on whether you think this is a short-run, idiosyncratic type of development, or is it something that will become something of a new normal, where we might have to be expecting this more often? And then I'll turn to another question. Well, maybe I'll ask the question right now. And on top of that, do you think that most localities do long-range planning particularly well? And if you do or don't, why or why not? Anybody want to?
25 words or less.
Oh, no, we got more time than that. So.
Well, I'll jump in. Mark Pizzato was my co-author, and we did research comparing the city of San Bernardino and the county of San Bernardino. And rarely do you have such a natural experiment where you have the lineup of demographics, economic forces, and the only difference was the choices they made. And the choices that the city of San Bernardino had made were disastrous. The choices that Greg Devereaux and the board chairman over it made led the county in a very different and more positive direction. So the answer to Raphael's question is, while we may not see more bankruptcies, we'll see the legacies of bad decision-making before the Great Recession in 2008 and after that Great Recession. The bankruptcies are just the most obvious manifestation of that bad decision-making. So you get to become bankrupt by design. It doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because of the environment. It happens because of the choices you make in reaction to the environment. So yes, I think you're going to see some more, if not bankruptcies, you'll see cities that made bad choices continue to flounder.
So I'll build on that a little bit, and that is that in the research that we've been doing with the Haynes Foundation support, we've found that there is very little incentive for local elected officials to think long-term beyond their terms, especially now at a time when there are term limits across the country in many locations. And so I'm only thinking the next 3 years, the next 5 years. And so we have to keep that in mind. There are some amazing folks who think long-term, and Ron Loveridge is one of those, and Ron is on my board. Plus we did look at Riverside, and they built in a lot of ways in which Riverside, for example, looked long-term and they looked short-term. And in some of our other research that we did, not only in localities, but also local government, but also we looked at school districts. And those school districts in Southern California that not only looked long-term, really looked at all of the different information points that they had access to in California and nationally, when they not only had that information themselves, but when they shared it with the community, when they shared it with their employees, when they shared it with the unions, so that everybody saw what was coming down the road, then they were able to plan long-term.
Yeah, I would agree with both Gloria and Rich on this. As for the number of bankruptcies that we're going to see, a lot of that is going to depend on the courts. There's some interesting legal issues being raised when you get into municipal bankruptcies as opposed to corporate bankruptcies. And you see that played out in Detroit as much as anywhere else. Because public employees are generally much better protected under state constitutions than employees in the private sector. And therefore, the flexibility that private firms tend to have in terms of their labor costs and obligations are somewhat different, and we're seeing that played out. Bad decision-making and a refusal to accept reality is usually what leads to that, or if not to bankruptcy, to real fiscal distress. A good corporation, whether it's public or private, can weather changes in the economy. In some cases, see changes in the economy as opportunities. Unfortunately, Gloria is correct. The term limits wave that hit the public maybe 15, 20 years ago is coming home to roost, because it creates a different type of elected official, one who is not looking long-term at his jurisdiction or her jurisdiction, but is looking long-term at his or her career. And thus you have the musical chairs that we see in California, of people bouncing from job to job, always being in office but different offices. And that changes your mindset. If you're on a city council and the next step in your career is the assembly, you're focusing on that, not on your city. If you're in the assembly and you want to be a congressman, you behave differently. So to put Rich's point in a different way, bankruptcies tend to be the result of human behavior. And a lot of the research that I've reviewed that this group has been doing indicates that we need behavioral change. The question is how.
Just several quick ideas. One, Raphael's point, I think, in the beginning of giving the federal data is that I think from the point of view of cities especially, you cannot look to help, much help from the federal government or the state government. So in many ways, cities are on their own, which I think requires us to do some of what is a great new book out, it's been out for a while by Katz and Bradley, called The Metropolitan Revolution. But its beginning theme is that the future of regions should not be a competition but cooperation. It's the last 2 points. One is there is a context for San Bernardino beyond poor decision making. I mean, it is its economy is not working. It has very low SES. It has toxic politics. If you has a charter which people think is maybe the worst in the state, that as you go through different factors, they all kind of line up and make life difficult for the city of San Bernardino. But I like to just raise one other issue, and I'm not a fiscal expert. I know something about electives, but I think there's also this issue of poverty. And what is California now has the highest poverty rate of any, at least the Census Bureau calculates the highest poverty rate of any state in the country. I think the poor cities, poverty cities, are the ones that face serious fiscal difficulty because of who lives there, their sources of revenue, a lack of social capital. But I think poverty and poor cities is another dimension of what we're looking at.
So that's a Thank you, Ron, for that. Gives me an opportunity to do a little plug for an event that we're having here on March 27th and 28th, which is a conference looking at poverty and ways that we might actively move the dial to eliminate it. So I hope everyone comes out to that, because that is a precursor, a precondition for preventing cities from being impoverished. I wanted to go back to two things that you guys have said. So Rich talked about bad choices, and Ron noted that, you know, San Bernardino had a whole host of other issues too. But in terms of decision-making, do you feel like there are some choices that are obviously bad at the time? Or, you know, how much of this is, you know, we went through an unprecedented recession, a lot of decisions that would have been good under ordinary circumstances look bad ex post. How should we think about that? And how, and this is for everyone, how should we think about, if you knew they were bad at the time, then how did they happen?
Let me use an example. Back in the olden days when I was CAO in San Diego County, Proposition 13 had passed, and a whole new type of elected official came in. Instead of the ones that many of us grew up with in the field, who really believed in the government that they were in charge of, you began to have avenging angels getting elected who really ran against their jurisdiction. During that time, there was a lot of tension between employees and elected officials, particularly on labor issues. And there were perhaps an understanding by elected officials that employee compensation needed to be adjusted upward slightly, but because they were against government, they did not want to be seen to do that. So rather than have cost of living adjustments, what they did is they bumped up pension benefits because it didn't show up in the budget, and it did not look like the elected officials were giving in to employees. As CAO and as somebody who'd been a budget guy, I advised against that, saying that it's better to understand that your costs are going up now than have your successors figure it out a few years later. They didn't listen. They went ahead and did it. But to answer your question, Raphael, they knew this was probably not a good decision to make, but it was the expedient one to make. And I would imagine, yeah, there were some really stupid decisions, but the ones that really affect fiscal health, I think they're made in the light of understanding that there might be a problem down the road, but that's down the road and we're not sure, but we can get through this issue, whatever it is, that way. So I can cite some really bad decisions. I just use that as an example of not a really bad decision, but a decision to sacrifice the long run for the short run that was made deliberately in the light of that information.
Well, I would add, I think that Raphael is exactly right. The focus is on the quality of the decision-making, and I think there's two aspects to it that we found in our research. Both the actual decisions and the processes which structured the decision-making. And being conscious, so in some places like Whittier School District, their superintendent was conscious of a process that involved civic engagement, building trust, and so good decision-making wasn't by accident. It was by real consideration of process. The other piece this invites significant consideration of, we've talked about the elected officials, but what really jumps out of the case study of the County of LA is the professionalism in finance and in public finance and in budgeting, exemplified by their former county treasurer, Richard Dixon, becoming the CAO after he'd been budget officer earlier in his career. Professionalism makes a difference. But who are you going to listen to in the decision making? Who are you going to be captive to? Raphael rightly raised the question of what are the incentives? And so to the extent that cities are able to, and districts and counties are able to structure decision making around professionalism, and Ron's point about, I can understand, look at the socioeconomics of a city, but I'd also look at what's the professionalism of their staff? And is that, I don't know that that's necessarily tied into the socioeconomics. If you have strong professional staff, you can work through these issues. If you have career professionals who are trained in these issues. And so that's another piece to add to the understanding of the dynamics of the decision-making, not just who the elected officials are, but what are the staff that are driving decision-making or not driving it.
Good. In your research, what role did you find for the unions, particularly the public safety unions, police and fire, in terms of shaping the decisions that were made?
Well, they were at the heart of the San Bernardino City case, I mean, in so many ways that we can't go into. But I think a point of this, where I would distinguish my thinking from yours is that they were choices made. Toxic politics wasn't inherited. Toxic politics was a byproduct of choices where eventually a city administrator or mayor had to get a restraining order against another elected official from coming in and badgering them. So,
But I was thinking, for elected officials, you ask who you pay attention to,
Yep.
where do resources come from, financial, manpower, perception, and public safety unions particularly have a major role, I think, in at least run a kind of context in which decisions are looked at.
a major driving factor, you've identified one of the, and how it's dealt with in the decision-making process is essential.
I believe that, I can't remember whose research it was, pointed out that jurisdictions which essentially collaborated and brought unions into the process tended to be more successful in long-term decision-making. Those that kept an adversarial role or tried to be openly anti-union for whatever reasons, those were the ones that tended to suffer. It's another thing, if nobody listens to you, you're going to find a way to get their attention. And you're right, Ron, I think San Bernardino is an extreme case of union control, but you find that to varying degrees in other jurisdictions as well.
So I'm going to talk, pivot a bit. Did you want to?
Oh, well, I wanted to kind of talk about decisions in the other way.
Go right ahead.
Okay. I just want to point out the example of a community that we looked at, and one is Brea, California, and we have the former mayor back here, Bev Perry. And what Brea did in terms of decisions that it made when it had fiscal implications that they had to consider, they decided, well, there are different ways we can do things. We can outsource this. We can collaborate with a neighboring city to make sure that our fire and our police are taken care of, together collaboratively. So there are a number of instances in which we have communities that have taken the opportunity to do something that may have been considered risky in the past, that they couldn't really do except in the face of a crisis.
Thank you. So I want to pivot now to doing it well. So I think that's a good way to go. I think we talk a lot about the complaints and all the problems, but I do want to think a bit about if you were going to start a process of long-range planning that was going to ensure sustainability, how would you do it? So first question is, who needs to be involved in this? And what do those folks need to know in order to have the right series and the right type of conversations?
Let me just introduce a complication before asking the experts. But if you haven't, the best general editorial magazine on state and local that I read is Governing Magazine. This is from their February issue. It was called Smart Money. Do state and local leaders know enough about finance? And the answer is no. And just two quick illustrations of, besides the turnover issue, is that the quote the chair of the finance committee for the city of San Jose, who's a retired police officer, and he says, $1 billion corporation, and here he's making financial choices. He says, I just don't know what I'm doing. I just had coffee with a retired police officer who's in charge of the finance committee of Riverside, and he says, what am I, a retired lieutenant? I don't know. And that's the question of how you integrate elected officials whose emphasis tends to be on economic development rather than on financial matters, and how the cities do it well, I'm curious.
Let me make a couple points on that. One, I was reading the summaries that was sent out to us, and two things came through. When you become an elected official, assuming you don't have a totally dysfunctional jurisdiction, your city attorney orients you to the government code, to ethical issues, all of the things that you need to watch for from a legal standpoint as an elected official. It occurred to, and the California League of Cities puts on an annual workshop for planning commissioners in terms of the mechanics and the issues associated with land use planning and their role. It seems to me that the League of Cities or some other organization could include in new elected officials' orientation an orientation to fiscal issues. Not to make them experts, but to make them understand it as they would understand the laws of conflict of interest and the need to keep your mouth shut in the middle of a judicial hearing, or in the middle of a hearing until all the evidence is in. That would be a minor but possibly significant way of doing that. The other one, and I'd be interested in Ron's reaction to this, as Raphael indicated, I bounce around a lot. I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different organizations. Usually I get hired when an organization is in trouble. And what I found is that if an organization knows it's in trouble, they'll tend to defer to the professional staff to help them get out of it. I became CAO in San Diego right after Proposition 13, and the Board of Supervisors was scared to death. So they basically asked me to help them get through it. And they deferred to me on most issues without getting in the way. And that's happened in other organizations I've been in. I've seen it around the country. Part of it is understanding you have a problem or you have a need. And understanding, as Ron says, that you're not an expert. So you turn to someone who is. It may be your city manager, it may be your finance director, it may be some outside group. But the trick is for, as an elected official, to realize you have a problem or a need. And not all elected officials will openly admit that.
So, Lori, so I've heard from Ron and Cliff, elected officials, city manager, city attorney's office, experts.
And I would say the community has to be involved. And their role is really setting out what they believe are the priorities. So what are the services that a city, for example, absolutely needs to provide? What's more important? In our research, we looked at the city of Long Beach. And for many years, in the early 2000s, they plugged budget holes using one-time only dollars that came in. And so they knew that this was problematic. They knew this, but they did this for many years until they couldn't do it anymore. And at that point, they brought in an acting city manager, a new acting city manager who was only going to be there for a short time, and they asked him to do a 3-year strategic plan, financial plan. And so what he did was he went out, he had, he knew that he could do some risky things, and one of those was to actually ask the community, what is it that you want the city to provide? And so that became their plan. And they also figured out how do they consolidate city budgets, city offices, how could they make sure that the community gets the services that they need. And sometimes that's not the city providing it. Sometimes it's others in the community.
So I think it's interesting that you characterized talking with your community as a risky thing. But I do want to come back to that in a little bit, because I think getting that voice and that input is important. The question is, how do you do it in a real and meaningful way? And I want to make sure we talk more about that. Rich, are there folks that we're missing here in terms of who should be involved?
Well, your question is the right question of how to do things well, and I think 5 pieces jump out and gets at your question of missing pieces. One is Jim Collins in his book Good to Great for the Social Sector and his other research talks about the need to confront the brutal facts. You can't make progress without that. Number 2 is what I mentioned earlier, who needs to be involved is professionalism, not just at the city manager level, but in the finance officers and up and down to really create, and we have one of the experts on org culture here, Peter Robertson, an organizational culture that supports fiscal sustainability. Number 3 is to really think of finance and budgeting as not sort of a once a year type of thing, but that finance is really connected to strategy, to connect strategy. 4th is a civic infrastructure along the lines that Gloria says, though some of our research, LA County is not profoundly connected to the community. But there are, what Mark Pisano likes to describe as civic infrastructure is important. You saw it in the county of San Bernardino. And the 5th and final piece is institutional memory. I mean, one of the drivers in LA County was the disaster in Orange County and the bankruptcy due to derivatives and bad investments there. These stories, where there was a bankruptcy by choice or by bad choices, need to be part of the discussion and the dialogue and not lost to, oh, well, that happened in a different place at a different time. So I'd say those 5 pieces jump out of what you need to do from the research to do well.
So it's interesting, because some of these things are actually not necessarily internal to the locality. So you talked about institutional memory. LA didn't go bankrupt, but Orange County did. But LA learned the lessons from Orange County, and I'm wondering sort
At
of
the county supervisor level, absolutely.
sort of how some might learn that lesson externally and others don't, right? So the distinction about sort of what is salient to people so that they say, oh, well, I need to pay attention to that and figure out what happened. And that there seems to be variation in that across localities, which is interesting. I actually think that self-awareness is critical, right? So I think of suffering places almost like alcoholics, right? And the first step to healing is to admit that you have a problem, right? And there's a lot of that goes on here as well. What leads to that self-awareness? How bad does it have to get before you can have a problem? Or can the subject matter experts inform in ways that are useful?
Let me just offer one slightly different direction, is that I think governance has changed over time in terms of the relationship electeds have to experts, city council members to city managers. Electeds are much more engaged. It really is sort of shared governance. It's not like school where the school superintendent rules and the school board meets once a week or once a month and goes home. So I think electeds play a much more important role today than they did 10 years ago or 25 years ago. Second, just a quick comment on the League of California Cities, I mentioned Raphael, I think is developing a tool for elected officials to answer the question, how is your city doing? Rather than fine, you have some answers. And the other is just that cities are always sort of looking for best practices. And I think the kind of research that's been identified and talked about needs to be out there in the public square, in a sense, so we know what it is and what it says.
That's a good point.
Absolutely, and just to build on Ron's comments, the research that we've been doing and the conversation we've been having with experts when we've drafted our case studies has been very helpful. And what we plan on doing what the National Civic League is going to be doing is incorporating these lessons learned and promising practices in a tool that we've been using for 85 years, the Model City Charter, which is the document that cities and counties use when they establish themselves and when they establish their charter or when they come back to revise their charter. And so this is going to be very helpful. This research is going to be very helpful as we revise it because it's been several years and it's a document that a lot of people pay attention to.
So I want to actually go to best practices. Let's just, if you had to pick like your 2 best practices or most promising practices that you would recommend to localities, what would they be? I mean, you've seen, a ton of case studies, like on the ground. If you're standing before a council, this is the answer. Well, not the answer, but.
Well, I would start with seeing finances connected to strategy and really start thinking strategically. Finance and budgets trap you into tactical thinking. So strategic thinking and practice, strategic practices. Number 2, and I think your previous question identified this, the challenge is in finding out what works. We know what works and we know what doesn't work. The challenge is really to get at your question of self-awareness and people who are driven by the core values of contribution and of service that can then adapt what works. We get the information out there. We're published in the National Civic Review, which is read by elected officials and appointed officials and career officials and the GFOA. The information's out there. The challenge is really recognizing or identifying and helping elected and career officials and appointed officials adapt and walk into their jurisdictions what we know works.
Well, what I would say is make your budget process and your finances understandable to the normal person. If you look at any report or any budget that's on a website, it's very hard to understand. Again, I'll cite Riverside. They do a 4-page kind of pamphlet that's understanding your budget. So they really break it down. They talk about the general fund and then the other funds and where your dollars go and where they come from. Where does the city budget come from? All of that is very understandable. So I would say that's the first piece. And the second piece, I think, is to involve your community in setting priorities. What are the priorities that your residents think the city needs to provide?
And so just to push that a little further, how do you think those things prevent us from getting into insolvency situations? So what is it about being transparent and about getting a broad set of voices to engage in the process that reduces vulnerability and increases sustainability?
I'd say that it basically allows elected officials the flexibility to make the right decisions because they can work within that framework and make decisions which, absent that transparency, might be controversial or risky. But if the elected officials understand that the community has been part of this process and that it may be necessary to reduce this service in favor of another or change the, whether it's something like business licenses or other types of things, that it's okay to do that because through a transparent process, the community, or at least the involved community, understands that that may be necessary for sustainability. So that's the advantage. It just gives the elected officials a comfort level politically to make the decisions. Which
It gives them cover, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a very different take on it. I think transparency, we talk about it as an end in itself. It's not. It's a means. It's a means to create accountability. In the absence of transparency, in the absence of the ability of civic groups or individuals to access what's going on, you can't have accountability. And what we know about organizational and institutional performance, in the absence of accountability, whether at the institutional level, rule of law, whether at the local level through transparency, in the absence of that, you can't get to good performance. In the absence of that, you can't get to sustainability. The research that Jan has done and others in Common Pool Resources, one of the key findings on that again and again is making available the information on the level of the depletion of the resource. The monitoring and enforcement is another way of saying, if you don't have accountability, you're going to deplete that resource. So transparency advances accountability. Civic groups and others outsiders having access to that information advances accountability. Then you can get to fiscal sustainability.
So, go ahead.
One just quick point about cities is that a lot of what organizations do is kind of complex, it's difficult, it's hard to monitor or follow. The cities, you have eyeball measures. You can see how a city's doing. You can see whether there's potholes, you can see whether there's graffiti, you can see maintenance questions. I mean, there is measures and markers of city progress which you don't find for many other governmental levels, which affects decision-making.
Yep.
And so I want to, so there's a bunch of literature that talks about the notion of responsible budgeting as a common pool resource. And I understand that in every city there are competing interests, and every interest wants all the money to be spent on their issue. That's kind of the human condition, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the budget becomes unsustainable, right? So why isn't there someone who says, we don't have the money, we can't do this? And why is that not the overarching discipline that happens here? So where's the role for leadership, and where's the role for being the adult in the room when everybody wants their pot? Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, Ron made a point later that I think is worth noting. When someone becomes an elected official, they have a focus by nature on economic development. So there's a belief that if only we can grow our economy, we can grow ourselves out of any fiscal issue they have. Thus, they want the sales tax, they want another car dealer, so the sales taxes will go up and so forth like that. So there's a countervailing attitude that yes, we have a budget problem now, but if we get that new company to come in or we annex this territory, that will go away. And thus there's always this goal out there. And it is difficult, Raphael, to find that council person that says, yes, maybe we'll get that car dealer, but
Until then.
yeah, in the meantime, we have to hold the line. I'm using a lot of personal examples. I just retired from the city of Carson, and it's been through its ups and downs, but there is a very large project under construction there. It's a 167-acre landfill that's being transformed into a huge retail housing complex, which is going to generate enormous amounts of property tax revenues and sales tax revenue when it's finished in 2016. Successive city managers have cautioned the council about counting that money before it comes in. Because the council is already spending the sales tax money that's there, or trying to. But so far, the professional staff has been able to warn them against that. That's a kind of an extreme case. But I think you'll find that attitude among elected officials. So hopefully, Raphael, on that council or on that school board, there is one adult who can carry enough weight there to impose that discipline. Staff can do it, but it works much better if there's a view on the part of elected officials. That's why I go back to, this league orientation for elected officials and fiscal issues.
So how much does the elected need to know? Right. So suppose suppose we accept governing Magady's notion that state and local leaders don't know enough about finance. How much do they need to know? I mean, do they need to go to line item? Does the transparency that goes to a broader community need to be at a deep level of detail in order to insulate against sustainability, insulate towards sustainability? What's the threshold level of knowledge that's needed, and how much can we lean on staff, or should we lean on staff and on the experts?
Let me just throw one other complexity out, is that
You're not making it easier here.
if you look at city budgets, they're mostly defense budgets. They're mostly public safety. I think some cities are higher as 85% public safety budgets. And, so when you come up with where you're going to cut, it's the things that make the quality of place that become open to reduce, because you don't want to reduce safety, you don't want to reduce police and fire. And I think it's one tension. One of these publications cited the city of Long Beach, which adopted a policy rule that they were not going to have more than 70% of their budget be devoted to police and fire. You can fudge that, I guess, in some ways, but I think one of the difficulties facing cities with these pension pressures and others is that the things that make city more interesting, particularly since redevelopment has gone away, there's less funding there.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I think there's at least three parts of the equation that you raise about. It does matter the individuals, the adult in the room, the effective leadership. It also matters the institutional design, the structure and the institutions that you set up and the processes that set up. And thirdly, the org culture matters. I mean, the major finding from performance in organizations is that organizational culture drives performance. So it's a hard piece to get at, but if you don't get at it, then you are relying either on structure or institutional design or on leadership. And I think we're better off when we have the three of those working in tandem.
So what structure are we missing? So what's the structure that we're not seeing in these places that allows them to fall into crisis? Like, what exactly should we be trying to get these places to change to look like?
One, and I think it's pointed out, particularly in Mark's research, is long-term thinking. The budget process by nature is a short-term process. It's year to year, or at best it's a 2-year process. And because it tends to be a very large ritual in most entities, it almost encourages you not to think too far ahead. A new element needs to be added, which is the long view, the 5-year outlook. In some communities, it's routine to get briefed on the national economy and the state economy or demographic changes that may have an impact. I just came in last night from the National League of Cities meeting, and there's a lot of talk about that. What's going on in the country demographically? What's the next economic cycle? We know we're going to have a stock market correction sometime this year. And if you can build that into the system, not necessarily at budget time. Sometimes it's better to talk about it off budget, so you're not so concerned directly about it. But for example, there's continuing concern at the National League of Cities about the future of the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is,
There should be.
CDBG.
yeah, which, as somebody who helped write that law, it's sad to see that it is, but it's what's happening to it is what was predicted would happen to it. As long as you have a block grant program and you cut it, you can't trace the grant money to the outcome. And thus you can play with the level. That's what successive administrations have done. The long view, in my opinion, is the community development block grant will disappear at some point. And it's going to continue to go down. So plan on it, don't fight it. And I use that as a common example among cities and some counties, is to understand what would we do or what's going to happen down the line if that program goes away. When I was in Los Angeles, it was getting $110 million a year through that program. In the 3 years I was there, it went from 120 to 105 over a 3-year period. And I'm sure it's less now. If you just look at it year by year, it's just a 5% cut. But if you look at it over 5 years, it's going to go down by 25% or 30%. And so think about what you're doing with that money so that when it goes away, you've provided for an appropriate transition. By taking the long view, you see things you don't on an annual basis. And somehow that needs to be, in my opinion, built into the policy processes of the community, whatever it turns out.
But doesn't this go back to Gloria's very first comment, that the incentives are all
The other
against
way.
that?
Yeah.
Right, so if that's our incentive structure, are you guys, should I infer that this is hopeless, that we're never going to be able to overcome this? Or are there things that you can put in place to force the long-term orientation?
Well, you can do it in bits and pieces. Something that when I was acting city manager in Carson, I did prior to the budget, is I had certain departments present their policy issues to the council. And one that was particularly noteworthy were the public works people, the people that maintain the roads and the streets and so forth. And public works is the first place to take hits, because by cutting maintenance, you don't appear to be cutting direct services. Well, they were able to show the council that the result of the cuts that have been making were resulting in more complaints and emergency service calls, and that it was also resulting in claims and settlements against the city. So they had actually been, the city was actually paying more as a result of deferred maintenance than they would have if they were doing the maintenance. That was very illuminating. It only affected one area, but it did affect the way the policy addressed that budget that year. And it's been my experience that instead of throwing a whole big issue at somebody, to get them used to thinking, get them used to think about one issue at a time. Things did not get the way they did this year. So it may take 3 or 4 years to get that. We did the same thing with Rec and Park. Carson is well known for the quality of its Rec and Park programs. What they hadn't realized, that they were being very inefficient in the way they were doing it because of the way issues had accumulated in their recreation programs. And again, that caused the council to make some kind of adjustments that didn't necessarily affect services that much, but gave them a way to do that. And again, it was a low-risk thing, because when you presented it, they didn't have to make any decisions. They had a chance to just talk about it. So when it came back at budget time, you could see the consequences of what they had done.
Well,
So just take it one step at a time.
Yeah, building on this consequence idea, I mean, a lot of our focus has been on the cities as city council and the counties as the county board and professional staff. But there's more at play at this, and I think of the work that Dr. Robert Ross is leading at the California Endowment with these place-based initiatives up and down the state for a 10-year, $100 million program. So it's not just city government that's trying to get at these intractable problems. There are partnerships out there on the national level, the National Civic Leagues partnerships. You know, and there's Don Kettle's definition of intractable wicked problems is one of the features is depleted intellectual capital. Well, you have people like Bob Ross at TCE, Chet Hewitt at the Sierra Health Foundation that are coming up with new ways to address these types of intractable problems within city government. You have other thinking. I see Hilda Blanco is here, or is here, looking at sustainability from an environmental standpoint. I think this needs to be added into the discussion so we don't make the mistake or we limit our thinking to cities as city councils and city staff, counties as board of supervisors and staff. That's a much broader set of, as Mark Pisano, talks about, really get at these problems through partnership.
Let me just really emphasize that. I mean, the city is not a moated place. There is an incredible number of organizations you belong to, electeds do, professional staff. And many of the issues that we were talking about are discussed in these places. And so I think the point is really well taken. You got to not simply think of the city as a single standing place, but it's involved in a whole labyrinth of networks.
So I understand that, but at the same time, is the California endowment going to prevent Riverside or San Bernardino from going into bankruptcy? Right. So what are the limits? Are there limits on what these third-party partners can do, and how much should we incorporate that into our thinking about what local government should do to remain fiscally sustainable?
One thing that they do is that if you understand that there are other resources in a community, you may be able to adjust your activities to take that into account. It's certainly not going to prevent some place from going into bankruptcy, but using healthcare as an example, if there are other sources of resources in a community for health services, and you're able to develop enough understanding with that entity, it will affect the way you allocate your own resources to health. Same thing with recreation. If there is an active Little League or Pop Warner program available, is it really necessary that the city offer its own youth programs? That sort of thing. If your police department has access to a larger 911 system, is it really necessary that the city have its own? That's where other resources come in. No, they will not prevent you from falling off a cliff if you're already halfway down, but it will give you a way to adjust services over time so that you can perhaps prevent that from happening.
Well, and the other,
Hold on for a second, because we haven't heard from Gloria for a while. I want to make sure.
Well, I was just going to say what these partners like foundations do is really give people the opportunity to think differently and to act differently. So sometimes it's, for example, the California Community Foundation after Southgate happened, what they did was they started a leadership program for the residents there. For them, it was city government 101, so that they understood what their role is. And so what the foundations also do is that they will allow you to bring in experts or share more about what are promising practices that we can really incorporate here. So I guess the example that really came to mind is thinking differently is when we've looked at the city of Pasadena. Well, they had to make some cuts in a number of their service programs, their public health programs. And what the city manager did was say to the staff, you have to find resources so that we can provide those services to our residents in a different way. So that meant they needed to go out and find grants. They needed to develop relationships with nonprofits and foundations and companies so that the services could be provided, housing services, health services, in a different way.
Could I say, do you think the state should play a more important role with fiscally troubled cities? I mean, there is some monitoring in other states of fiscal health of cities. In California, if school districts go into the tank, the state steps in. We don't like the idea of the local control and said, don't go there. But do you think the state has some role to play? Because it struck me on the city of San Bernardino as the state simply took a walk on problems that the city faced. Could I ask that?
state government turns out has had its own set of budget problems. We really haven't explored that question. I mean, there are clearly things state government does that exacerbated the challenges with the collapse of redevelopment funding. It also exposed how it was being used, not for redevelopment, but for general operations. And not just in city of San Bernardino, Oakland, other places, So, the capacity, I mean, I come from a state where there's heavy monitoring. Raphael and I are both from South Jersey, and, you can game that system too. Camden, New Jersey has not been the model of fiscal health for years, and there's probably no other city that has greater state monitoring. So I'm not sure that's the direction to go.
Yeah, I would agree. California is probably at one end of the spectrum in terms of a hands-off attitude toward the operations of local government. States like Michigan, Florida, Ohio, and New Jersey. The states play a much greater oversight role. But I agree with Dr. Callahan here. The state is the last people you want to come into affairs. When I was at NLC yesterday, it was interesting the legislative issues that they were most concerned about at the federal level. It wasn't so much looking for more federal aid. I think they understand that that era is over. What they wanted the federal government to do is to stay out of their pockets. And a big issue with local governments now is tax reform, where there's a move that has been proposed by the administration to eliminate or reduce the tax exemption of municipal bonds. And
It's in the House budget proposal.
yeah.
For
And-
tax reform.
And the cities see that as the federal government putting their hands in cities' pockets, because tax exempt bonds are critical to maintaining the city's infrastructure and as a long-term investment. And if the cost of that goes up or the investors go away, it's going to be very, very serious for the communities financially. So I use that as an example at the state level. What you want to do is to keep the state out of your pocket. They did it with redevelopment. They have been doing it by changing some of the sales tax calculations and how sales taxes are distributed. And of course, because the funding for things like highways is been coming under a lot of scrutiny, it could affect infrastructure. So to answer your question, the best thing for cities is for the states to stay out.
So to some extent, so I understand that, when there are fiscal pressures, the different levels of government are going to fight with each other.
Yeah.
And I also understand that the lowest levels of government have the least ability to really insulate themselves from what the higher levels want to do. But sometimes there has to be some value in outside third party coming in and setting the ship straight, right? That, all the interests have become such a tango that the sensible solution can't operate politically and emerge from the inside. That's the Detroit model, where they imposed a receiver. It's happened in Washington, D.C., it's happened in New Orleans, a lot of other places. Should we not have done those either?
Well, those are the basket cases, and the state came in after everything went bad. I'm not sure in California you have a state apparatus that can do that. In the case of schools, they do, but schools are basically education is a state issue, and there just happen to be local school boards to do it. So there's a vested interest in the state in the integrity of the education process. Local governments deliver a variety of local services, very few of which can be said to be of statewide concern. So I think it's a little harder to find that nexus.
Right.
What about the Serrano Priest kind of concept for cities, though? That is, why I live in a poor city, why should I have poor police service, poor fire service, and inadequate parks? If the state invests in poor schools, why shouldn't there be some similar premise for poorer communities?
Well, that's a little different situation, because in that case, the state is changing policies in a way that might affect or equalize resources to cities. I thought the question had to do more with, when Vallejo was in trouble, should the state have stepped in
Right.
and
Yep.
taken over negotiations? No, as far as state policies, you know, Serrano versus Priest, using that's the equalizing education resources. That makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't disagree with that at all.
So I want to now turn to the audience and take questions from you. So if you have questions, I'm happy to bring them into the conversation. Deepak?
All right. Great discussion. The city of Jurupa Valley is disincorporating because of a shift in revenues from the state. And my question goes to you in terms of, is there too much fragmentation at the local government level? Do we really want that many cities? Is it sustainable? And you see this kind of basket cases, and these seem to be like by design. They're always teetering at the edges, they're always kind of one step closer to bankruptcy. So my question is, when I look at just Jurupa Valley, it's 97,000 people, right? Which are now disincorporating, going back into the county, unincorporated area. You look at West Hollywood, which may be 30,000 and, doing well, financially very stable, have the sales tax socioeconomically very strong. So the question is, do we look at those, and I'm not a student of this, but do they look at these key performance indicators as in the financial strength, a kind of a balance sheet for the last 5 years, as in you can sustain yourself for the long term, and that you're not just, for every little business economic cycle, they are ready to falter. The city of Paris, city of Rialto, Colton, I can go on, and in LA County there are many cities. Is this model sustainable, this local government fragmentation model sustainable?
So the answer is yes. I mean, this gets at Raphael's question about should you have oversight. And the fundamental principle we know about effective decision-making is get closest to the people who are closest to the problem. It cuts across all sorts of research. It cuts across decision-making. The research that's been done on this is really the research that Vincent Ostrom did at UCLA and Jack Boland's, the debate between metropolitan government and polycentric government. And for all the cases you cite, there's these cases of exceptionally successful cities. And so the idea that less fragmentation in cities will bring about better governance, there's just not the research to support that.
I think he was asking a different question, which is not that within any one city you'll see better government, but if you have a larger scale, does that allow you to operate at better efficiencies? And that if you fragment so much, you just
Right.
have a tremendous replication of the same functions that will drive jurisdictions to be closer to the edge.
So the research shows that the smaller ones, when they're consolidated, there can be some economies of scale, and then you reach a point where consolidation doesn't deliver cost effectiveness.
There's another way of looking at it, and Los Angeles County is a good example. And this is the contract cities idea. And there are cities in Los Angeles County, there are 88 cities in Los Angeles County, some of whom contract with the county or another jurisdiction to provide a certain service. They will contract with the sheriff to be their police department. They'll contract with the county fire district to be their fire department, which are the two of the biggest drivers of city budgets, because they found that it is more cost effective to do it that way.
And I would just say we have a mayor from a contract city sitting in our midst,
Okay.
Frank Serenian from Rolling Hills Estates.
Yeah, and Carson, where I come from, is also that way. And that's a service that can be, in many cases, better delivered on a larger scale because of the total capacity of an organization. And that's sort of a midpoint between a full-service city and disincorporation. I think Los Angeles County is probably more sophisticated about this than any other place in the country. But it's a model that I think most of the cities that have gone into this contracting mode have found to be useful. Jurupa Valley is an interesting case because they just incorporated a few years ago, and then the state, screwed them.
Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, but I would argue that a midpoint between disincorporation and full service is contracting.
Yes.
I'd like to focus in on the city of Los Angeles. You mentioned adversarial government. I would sort of maybe describe it as you don't trust City Hall. You know, we have a situation where we have structural deficits of $250 million next year, 700 over the next 4 years, pension liabilities up the kazoo, streets stink, sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera. And I just don't think that people really trust City Hall. You have an unwillingness of the elected, of the city council to make tough decisions. Everything's a one-off. You have, quite frankly, they don't really have a good understanding of the finances of the city. And in that regard, I was wondering, would it make sense to have a city charter, and it probably doesn't apply only to LA, a city charter amendment which would require the city to live within its means? And that would say something like, you know, they got to do 5-year financial planning, operational planning. They have to have 2-year balanced budgets based on a funny concept called general accepted accounting principles. And over the, let's say, next 15 to 20 years, fund the pension plans, fully fund the pension plans, and fix our streets, our sidewalks, and the rest of our failing infrastructure. So that's the question. Does it make sense to put in charter reform to make sure that these guys downtown behave themselves financially?
You know, California Forward, it's much of its agenda that you identified. They were talking about putting it on the ballot,
Yeah.
and they didn't do it.
Yeah, sometimes we need guidelines, and they need to be written down.
So, I mean, I hear that. I do want to raise the question of, you know, sometimes the appetite is not as big as it's bigger than you can handle, right? And, you know, there is a question fundamentally, if you have pensions, if you have the roads, if you have the sewers, if you have the port, if you have job creation, you know, does the existing tax structure support that? Or are we looking at something more fundamental? And I think that's a challenge that, you know, that we all face, every jurisdiction faces. And Los Angeles is facing it faster because of its tremendously large and increasing pension challenge. But it is a whole conversation, and maybe the conversation around that charter would spark a deeper conversation about how do we support all the things that we want.
How viable do you think an idea like participatory budgeting is, and what are the limitations in implementing that at maybe like the local level?
Well, it's a growing movement, and I think that it's terrific because people really get to understand what a budget is, and they get to decide, okay, well, if I'm going to give more money to safety, where will it have to come from? So in our view is, I think it's amazing. I think it's great. I think there are many more communities that are looking at it now. The city of Denver, city and county of Denver is using it, but not very many people know about it. I think the limitation is that it's online. If it's complemented with, it's mostly online, if it's complemented with actual dialogue and conversation in the community, I think it would be even better and stronger.
I guess mine is a follow-up question to this whole idea of community engagement. And the reality is that a lot more people are invited to participate than actually participate. And so how do you kind of balance what may be very extreme ideas about what should be done with public resources, with people's inability to kind of participate in that conversation? So how do you make sure that when you're listening to those very kind of interested voices, that they're representative of another set of people who may have a set of concerns but just don't get into the room or don't get to the website?
Well, the great advantage of local government is sort of access, and it's not simply access at a formal meeting at the council chambers. At least for electeds, you're there 24/7, so to speak, in the community. And so much of what you hear is not what happens on council day. It's all the other kind of sources.
Yes, so I agree. So in Denver, what the mayor does is he actually has Saturdays, every other Saturday or something. will go with all of his department managers into a specific community, so communities across the city. And that's where people can talk about problems, talk about what they want to see done, and they can actually talk to the mayor or their elected officials and their department managers all in one place. So taking City Hall to the community is one way.
When Willie Brown transitioned from being Speaker of the Assembly to being Mayor of San Francisco, he referred to the change as moving into retail politics. That, you know, as opposed to legislation and the exercise there, people could go up to him on the street and
Yeah.
and they would talk to him. Gloria's absolutely right, and Ron are absolutely right. In a way, you can't get away from public opinion. And that's good. I mean, that's the,
Yeah.
and that information, that feedback you get is really, in most cases, more quality, has better quality than what happens at a public hearing. At least you can filter what you hear at a public hearing against what you heard in Albertsons yesterday.
So you have time for one more question. You can.
Oh, I think, just to answer a little bit more Dave's question, I think it also is imperative that if you decide you are going to open your community up and do civic engagement, and I would think most cities would want to, because it's a tremendous form of getting information from the residents who you are supposed to be serving, is to make sure that when you invite people to come, if you have a formal type of a setup for whatever it may be, participatory budgeting, a strategic plan for the city, whatever, that you make sure that you're inviting people from all sectors of your community, and that you make sure, and this is a hard thing to do sometimes because you grimace, but you make sure that the bomb throwers are invited along with the people who pat you on the back and tell you how much they like what you're doing. Because when you have all those voices in the room, then you're getting the entire picture. And what's interesting is usually the group finds an equilibrium, and they'll find things that they agree on, and those who just want to scream and yell but have no solutions tend to get told by the others in the room, not the electeds, not the city officials, to sit down, shut up, and participate, or leave, because you're not being helpful. And that's why you want to make sure you have that entire spectrum of people. Sorry, just had that.
No, I appreciate that. It's always good to tell people to sit down, shut up, and play fair. We are actually over time, but before we go, I want to ask each of our panelists to give one thing that they hope happens, or one piece of advice you would give to local jurisdictions as they think about maintaining and preserving their fiscal sustainability. Ron?
Well, two musings. Well, one is the internet. I think it's changing the dynamics of information, and it's beyond public hearings and what the newspaper says. I mean, I thought Newsom's book, Citizenville, is worth a very careful read. The other is just the argument for a smaller city as opposed to Los Angeles. I remember there was a political scientist named Bob Dole, who just recently died, but he was asked the question in his presidential address, what's the ideal size of community, of a polity? And he pitched the number somewhere between 200 to 300,000. Large enough to have the resources, but small enough to make a difference and have access. And so one of the problems perhaps in Los Angeles is it's 4 million people.
Much bigger than that.
Yeah, it's bigger than that.
Cliff?
The issue of civic engagement is important because citizens themselves, either collectively, either as groups or individually, can put a lot of pressure on cities to be more open and to share more and to let elected officials know that it's okay to admit that you have a problem and you need help. We can have all of the research findings, the books, the league, but if a community itself tells the city, we have a problem and we want to help you solve it. So I think putting more resources into civic engagement, one way or another, in the long run, can help but benefit the community.
Gloria?
That's my comment, but I want to add, the whole idea of regional collaboration is really important, and I think it goes to the kind of small cities working together, and the idea, for example, in the Denver region, they have fast tracks, they're light rail, and it's in some communities already, and it's, in 10 or 20 years, it'll go to the other communities, but those communities that already have it have made a commitment to continue to fund it for the other communities to get it in the future. And that's a big commitment, and it's rare and it's important to see.
And Rich?
I'll be entirely self-serving. Read our articles that are published in the National Civic Review last year, this year, and the year before. Read the work that Jan Tang's leading the way with on looking at common pool resources and finance, and other articles that we've written, and watch this video.
Thank you. So, Rich Callahan, Gloria Rubio-Cortés, Clifford Graves, and Ron Loveridge, thank you for a really interesting conversation and discussion. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you.